Gracias, gracias. Fernanda. Se nos perdió una de las panelistas. Fernanda Vallejos. Tiene una capacidad para desaparecer impresionante. Ya, estamos. Vean, bueno, buenas tardes. Vamos en el último panel para terminar esta maratónica conferencia de la Tindad y de la Red de Justicia Fiscal, que demuestra la capacidad de aguante que tenemos todos y todas después de estos 2 días intensos, de interesantes y muy fructíferos conversatorios. Vamos a hacer el panel final sobre el tema de integración. A manera de introducción, este es un tema nuevo que está incorporando la Tindad, dado la importancia de que volvamos a colocar en la agenda el tema de la integración regional, y máxime con los cambios políticos que se están dando hoy en la región, con los cambios también de la geopolítica, como hemos visto a nivel global, y por tanto hoy en este panel queremos tener visiones muy distintas, complementarias, en todas las posiciones. Hemos invitado a Fernanda Vallejos, que espero que aparezca. Cuando el tabaco consume a la gente. Fernanda Vallejos, compañera argentina, exdiputada. Está el compañero Patricio de Chile, de una plataforma de movimientos sociales, Chile Mejor sin TLC, y de la plataforma latinoamericana, y nuestra querida amiga y compañera, que no le puedo decir el nombre, sino Mocha, activista, Aída Naranjo, Aída García Naranjo, porque siempre me corrige. Y luego tenemos 2 comentaristas de lujo que están en forma virtual. Está la querida compañera Mónica Valente, secretaria ejecutiva del Foro de Sao Paulo, y está nuestro querido amigo y compañero Ricardo Patiño, ex canciller de Ecuador, militante político, y ellos 2 les hemos pedido, porque Mónica y Patiño, que nos expresen las valoraciones de 2 articulaciones políticas.
The assessment of 2 very important political groups. They are the Sao Paulo Forum and the Puebla group that Ricardo is a member of, and which is and where Mónica is the Secretary General. Having said that, we're going to start by listening to Fernanda's comments, words. Fernanda Vallejos is a license holder from the University of Buenos Aires. She's a senior economist of the Economic Project Foundation. She was a national parliament representative for Unidad Ciudadana and finance coordinator for Sovereign. sovereigns. We have asked her as an Argentinian political activist and militant to share her thoughts in the first place about how she regards Argentine's role in the change, evolving context, and from the new call to discuss about integration, we should recall that Argentina is the pro tempore president of CELAC, and what are the challenges she sees as coming, and we will listen to her for the next 20 minutes. And also she will be talking about the internal conditions in Argentina. So we're all ears, Fernanda. Thanks very much, Jorge. Greetings to the other members of the panel, whose presence actually honors me, as well as the presence of those who have been participating in the prior panels, and quite obviously our gratitude to all those who have contributed to organizing this event. It is always a pleasure and a source of happening beyond the adversity that our countries go through, to have the opportunity to talk and think together. Without a doubt, we are experiencing the consequences of the pandemic and then the war. These are definitely two overarching topics of international geopolitics. But if we have to think about the structuring factors that will shape the geopolitical structure in coming years, what I think should be the main source of concern and the driver of our objectives that we can push forth at CELAC and all the organizations that we are involved. I think that dynamics is basically overarched by the civilizatory crisis that impacts not just Latin American citizens, both male and female, men and women, but entire humankind, and the dispute for the world's hegemony between the U.S. and China that will determine the new alliances, hierarchies, and the inequality patterns that will come along with a new emerging world order, and the roles of the type of insertion in the international order that we may be able to design and build for our own countries as part of the new order. When we think about the ongoing systemic crisis, I would venture that there are two historical times. The first one, the initial industrialization of European countries and the U.S. in particular, that then move towards the monopolistic stage of a capital concentration in that context of overuse of coal and then hydrocarbons, oil, led to the one of the components of the civilization crisis that has to do basically with a climate crisis, and the other turning point has to do with a crisis in the 1970s. After the Second World War, and when it became obvious that the crisis of the 1930 was the consequence of the operations of the large financial corporations that were totally out of control. A number of strong protection, social protection, and financial regulation was put in place, and that also led to better wages in the labor market that place the workers in a different position. Since the 1970s, this social safety net crumbled, and saying in a couple of words, the need emerged to rebuild earnings and profits of large corporations that clearly since the 1960s they had been profiting from. And one of the guidelines that were set up to increase those profits had to do with a relocation of the large corporations affiliates that were already transnational, multinational corporations to the periphery. And that's when Asian countries became industrialized, in particular China. And when China opened up to the capitalist economy and made China a large manufacturer and exporter, with large corporations producing and exporting to China, including their home countries. And of course, this brought down production, the cost of durable goods that was always a need, that was also a need because clearly lower wages meant that domestic demand and purchasing power went down, which required reducing the cost of production, and also to mitigate social conflict in this new setting that we know as the neoliberal stage. I have some quotations that I might eventually, if I have enough airtime and power to share with you, and to consolidate the neoliberal stage. Some key issues relate to IMF policies that we are all familiar with in our countries and economies, and that should be totally functional to impose global scale adjustment to reduce wages and salaries, and that will eventually lead to the smaller share of wage earnings and national income. Not to make this introduction too long, the liberal order that was set up through this regulatory system that was set in place, and that displaced the social protection system, and in its stead there was a new order set up that was basically guided by multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. That's the singular pole, one pole order, where these organizations are totally out of the purview of the democratic examination of peoples, and at the end of the day it is the United States that have the final word, and the large corporations that are behind that country's power. And as I just mentioned, this issue that seemed initially as a complement between corporate Western economic power and the possibility of relocating production to China eventually created the conditions for the emergence of this new scenario that we are living in, where China is now starting to compete eye to eye with the United States in terms of purchasing power, parity, China's GDP exceeds the U.S. and by 2028, in current dollars, the Chinese GDP will exceed the U.S. GDP, and of course they compete fiercely in terms of investment flows. It is clear that there is an emerging order that has a totally different characteristics that is emerging right in front of our very eyes, and that's where I think the questions that we should pose ourselves come from, and the challenges for the political action of our countries and our regional organizations like CELAC, for instance.
Estado signados a lo largo de toda nuestra historia.
Throughout our history, our economies, our countries have been marked by colonialism with varying characteristics. We still live into this colonialistic situation that has kept us in backwardness despite the great wealth and riches of our countries with their own individual characteristics, of course. And although the U.S. and Europe have shown throughout history that they will not be afraid to intervene in other countries, and in many cases quite brutally, as was the case during the dictatorships that our countries went through, and that were the initial kickoff to introduce neoliberalism in our region, and that China appears as a different model, at least a model of non-interference with other countries' internal affairs. It is also true that the extractivist model, at least as far as we can see, concerning China's role and its interaction with the periphery economies like ours, it is not very clear that leaves much space left in that model. If we think in terms of a potential future Chinese hegemony, that perhaps not in the very distant future, that would leave some space to play a different role in regards of the insertion of our countries in this new international order. It seems to me that this is one of the main challenges that we already have to address, because if we can anticipate, even with a very small time window, in which direction the world is going and what are the transformations that are taking place at present, against that backdrop, I think it is our responsibility in this time, and I'm going to say this directly to some of the colleagues from the panel, this is also a generational responsibility to think, discuss, design, and work so that our countries and the entire region, because obviously this is not something that we can do in isolation individually, each of our countries, but requires rather the integration and effort and the consolidation of regional integration of our economies. But we have to think what's the role we want to play, what's the position we want to fill in this new order, in this new emerging order. And of course this goes way beyond the specific conditions in each of our countries, and that opens a window of opportunity vis-a-vis the future to ourselves and obviously for the future generations.
And I believe that due to our history and due to our tradition, I believe that we need to think about the responses to those fundamental questions, from the need of having to imagine projects not just around one or other hegemony, but rather around the recovery of projects of sovereignty and of independence from in our region, where we think we have a lot to provide. Only here in this conference and during these last 2 days, we basically cover all the big subjects that I believe Latin American, Caribbean could and should encourage as their own, but as a proposal to offer to the rest of the countries of the world, and also as a bridge for the construction of an articulation with all the population or the people of the world that share the same view. That has to do indefinite about thinking on a project that's self-centered, on a project that will establish the smart use of natural strategic resources, but also in fast exhaustion, a process that can think about how can we overcome the huge gaps of inequality, the multidimensional especially. And if we believe that this is an agenda that's prioritarily want to assume in Latin America and Caribbean, facing of course the rest of the people of the world with which we will be sharing the need of sharing a project of this type of characteristics, because probably we won't have many characteristics for a happy and sustainable future for the whole of humanity, but the construction of a historical focus that will involve everyone from any region and from any nationality, in a way that we can share our aspiration of a sustainable world and of societies and definite that are more humanized, to call them a way than we've known so far. And in no way that can be possible in a world that works the way that has been working so far, where we only have a handful of corporations and countries and a group of allied countries, the ones that make the decisions about the life of the rest of the humanity, and especially in the usage of these resources, which are common assets, and they are limited. And if we believe that this is the agenda that we need to encourage as ours, and I'm going from the midterm to the most immediate term, there's a couple of elements that we shouldn't just rule out. One of them has to do with the crisis nowadays we're facing, the consequences of the pandemic, of the war. We've mentioned about this in previous panels. Economies that appear now over-indebted on one side, meaning ourselves, and on the other hand we have an hegemon, which in this case it doesn't stop increasing the interest rate, and this puts us in a potential scenario for a new crisis of debt that we've already suffered in the 80s. Back then we failed in our attempts of building a group of debt-bearing countries that can establish themselves as a sovereign position, a geopolitical position of the debt, with the necessary needs and audits, and trying to go in against those debts that are needed for us to be considered, or for them to be considered in the legal framework of the whole. So one of the challenges that we have is to retake these agendas, if you like, the Jubilee agenda, if you want to call it something, where, as in previous decades, we've failed. We can be based now in the experience that we have. We can be capable of building success, and I think that this can also be a really important tool that will stop us, or will put us in a position of strength to face this mid-term agenda. And another of the elements that we shouldn't rule out is it's clearly put out in a document, which was the text that we've talked about. We also had the OTA document, but this one also had to do a lot with us, and I wanted to read a bit of it if I can find it. where the chief of the Southern Command, Laura Richardson, explains and presents that document from the Southern Command, where we see clearly expressed how central this is for the U.S., for its allies, and the availability of strategic resources to the reservoir of strategic resources that our region mean. Particularly, I saluted that document, and I just found it. What does it say textually? Richardson raised this in March of the Armed Committee Services of the U.S. And what does it say? Of course, this is in the context of the hegemonic confrontation between the U.S. and China, and it says, in that context where we explain the concern of the Chinese presence in our region, and it says that the U.S. should work with different commands, and they're thinking about the African Command, the allied nations, the Congress, the U.S. agencies like USAID, that has financed the destabilization process in our economies and in our economies. And the NGOs and the private sectors also. Why? Because let me highlight this. Because the area of the Southern Command withholds 60% of the lithium of the world, 31% of fresh drinking water, and huge reservoirs of oil in the Amazon. Why am I putting these two next together, Southern Command and Richardson? Because of a potential debt crisis that can emerge, one right next to the other. So due to a historic memory exercise and what happened in the 80s, the resolution, between quotes, of the debt and the crisis implied the instrumentalization of the baiting program imposed by the U.S. in the 90s, where among different things our countries ended up being deployed, or our countries ended up being deployed from our public patrimony, from our public companies. So it's inevitable in this context, or ask ourselves, what could be the potential resolution for a potential debt crisis? And these have happened again and again in the last few times, and they tell us how hungry we are for our richness, at least from the U.S. side. And we are getting some hints and some clues that make us focus immediately into the defense of sovereignty on our natural resources. That's on one side, as a prioritary matter. 2 minutes, okay, and with this, I'll finish off. But, well, like I was saying, in parallel with that, the search for a solution to the problem of debt. And I'm talking from Argentina's side, and it's difficult to unstick myself from there, but beyond the extra load that weighs on the backs of Argentinians, undoubtedly this is a problematic that will affect all of our region, and that was in the pandemic. And I'm convinced right away that we could get this drag out of ourselves, and it's also a part of the solution to be able to not just think about it, but to propose and to build in a more effective way, to have tools to build upon this more effectively. An agenda of mid and long term where our region and our countries can have a protagonist or a main role. In that case, they shouldn't submit back again, God knows for how long, to a submissive situation of postergation or domination, the way that we had to live in this. last stage. And just to finish off and as a final conclusion, I would say that in this crisis context that we're going through as countries, as regions, and as humanity in civilization terms, we have to, and even it sounds like a cliche, we need to understand it and live it and represent it and activate politically from that spot. How can we build it and how can we be the main characters in our own constitution for a unique opportunity in an undoubtedly important moment in this systemic transition that we're living through. So I think that this is one of these challenges that Argentina has from CELAC, to be able to work in the articulation of these agendas that I believe are the huge strategic points for our countries and for our people from now on and into the future. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fernanda. Up next, we have Patricio López. He is a journalist, master in theory, history of art from the University of Chile, and a master in communication from the Catholic University of Valparaiso. He's a professor from the University of Chile and from Catholic University of Valparaiso, and the director of Radio Universidad from Chile, and a coordinator for the platform Chile Better Without the FTA. We've asked Patricio to give us his point of view about the neoliberal axis that the integration had in Latin America that has been essentially through the free trade agreement, the insertion of Latin America in the global economy, and also the inclusion interfinancially within the region that's based in these FTAs. So what are the consequences of these policies, of this integrationistic type of policy, neoliberal of free trade for our people? Thank you. Well, okay, how are you doing? Good afternoon to all of our colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity of being able to be here all together and in some cases to re-encounter and exchanging points of view, because when each and one of us was or is within our own context and thinking about our own problematic, it's difficult to systematize us as a whole and for a possibility that to be able to solve what some countries are living in comparison to what our colleagues and our brothers and sisters are living in different countries, which are all alike situations. So collectively, we've been impacted by the pandemic and now by the effects of the situation, such as the worries and recession. But I come from a country that in a few years had to live through a social outburst and a constituting process, and that made us on one side to be really hopeful, but on the other hand also really tired for the effects of being able to bring in some words that can help us to help you out. I was thinking about how much has Chile changed in the last 4 years, and that some of the things were tiring and that seemed impossible, and that older people would tell us, and that our foreign friends would tell us about that lived in Chile, and some of them had lived here, and it seemed that we were never going to recover from that. But now it seems like we are on only word in 7 letters, which is the word apruebo, or I approve. We are summarizing all of the hopes and frustrations and all the possibilities that our people have about recovering important levels of sovereignty. I'm saying this as an opening because, in a way, what's happening in Chile has to do with the background that and the history that we lived in our country related to FTAs, but also with the process of collective exchange and the exchange of points of view, reflections with the different colleagues from different countries of the region regarding how this phenomenon has been going on in the last years. So undoubtedly we have a base, like Fernanda mentioned, we have the dictatorship matter that was the background to establish the most harsh side of the neoliberal model, and it affected all of the countries of the continent. And maybe these gradients have to do with the levels of depth that are principles that have been implemented, and with the possibilities that each one of the countries has to revert them. We had certain parts in the continent which are the ones linked more to the cycle of progressive models, where some of these policies were able to be reverted with a lot of strength and enthusiasm. But in Chile we didn't have a neoliberal era, but we are living in a neoliberal model for 40 years already. And so if you go to Santiago de Chile and you talk to people about a neoliberal decade, they are not going to understand what you're talking about. So Chile is one of the countries where the neoliberal model has been implemented in a more in a deeper way. For those that don't manage information and for those that have a context element, Chile is additionally the country that has signed more FTAs with a greater amount of countries in the world. There's no other country in the world that has signed as many FTAs as Chile, and additionally they has been identified as a state policy and as a state of external foreign relations. So you know that when you mix a policy of state and a policy of foreign affairs, you start moving, or you move to a neighborhood that's closer if you want to stray away from there, and it's considered as a treason basically. But for a long time we had to learn how to articulate our point of view and the political actions that we can put these actions up to the limelight, and to put some examples and to give you some examples so you can have this clear enough. For example, when in Chile we worked this FTA with the US, there was only one vote against, and the only deputy that was against this was taken to the tribunal of his own party, the Socialist Party of his. He was part of the Socialist Party, and he was tried and almost kicked out of them. And Jorge remembers that because I believe that you were in that party back then, I think. So the FTA with Vietnam was managed in 48 hours. You can think that I'm just speaking rhetorically or exaggerating, but the treaty or the agreement entered on a Tuesday, passed through the deputies and deputies and the Senate's chamber, then through the different commissions chambers, and on Thursday it was approved. So it's impressive how a country that had this history became the country that was able to articulate a critical response facing FTAs. And the element that produced the changing or the shift point or the breaking point was the FTP. So as many other countries of the country which are co-signants of FTP, and I'm talking about Peru, Mexico, we had to find, surprisingly, about this agreement that was completely being kept in secrecy, that was foreign from our public scrutiny, and authorities weren't able to provide information about what was being negotiated, not even with the political parties that they were a part of. And this generated citizens a concern about getting to know the content of this agreement, and that pressure to wanting to know the point of this agreement transformed slightly into a possibility of doing alliances, the political kind that we weren't able to do in Chile for a long time. Just to give you some examples, it was really hard or difficult for our country to find themselves in a common space, in the common workers and women workers, or the sector of health and professional sectors and NGOs, and maybe other more territory-focused movements. And this type of alliances were taking place based with the 1111 TPP, covering a lot of ground without the prejudice of many of scopes, and they were also, or they generated the possibility for us to identify what was the common pattern that will allow us to, for organizations of different types, to generate a common front facing different interests. So when Chile was living through that, we were a part. And I remember quite well, because when we just started to articulate this Latin America platform and the Better Without FTA platform, we had the colleagues that were a part of the Mercosur bloc, and we were also the Pacific Alliance countries there. So we lived really different realities. And in the case of Mercosur, I don't want to come into detail, but you know that this is an alliance that has a broader conception of the market than what we have in the Pacific Alliance, but this didn't have to do with the commercial side of it, but with the fact that back then we said, and that just remained with me, that this is the spine of the U.S. had 4 vertebrates: Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and Chile, which were precisely the countries that were signers of the Pacific Alliance. But we started producing a conference that had different episodes. One of them that was the most important was the expulsion of Venezuela from Mercosur, the alliance where the decisions have to be made by unanimity, and immediately after that, with the arrival of right-wing governments, 2 countries that had previously had a different agreement within Mercosur, they started to look at the Pacific, and they started to look at Chile as a country that eventually they will be able to allow this transition. And that's how it was firsthand. Chile started negotiating, and finally they ended up signing an FTA with Uruguay. Uruguay basically didn't have any FTA experience in their own financial policy and in their international policy. Chile had a long experience about it. That's why we had an important piece of work of conversation, not just with the organizations that work directly in this topic, but with organizations of workers, organizations of different types that wanted to know from the point of view of the Chilean experience, what did it imply, the signing of the FTA. Of course, the media control, the control of academic work made it really difficult to generate these points of view that were different or dissident from the policy that was being implemented. In our country, it was said, and in Uruguay we also heard that it was really different to have an FTA with the big powers than the ones that you can have with the countries of the region, because in the case of the countries of the region, we were talking about South-South alliance, and even more so, even the Bachelet government or the Mujica government, nobody could have something against it. But that was where the danger lived. And I want to, at the end of my presentation, to record what I'm going to say right now, because now that we are coming back to the cycle of progressive cycle, we want to, or we know that the cycles of administration change, but not the policies. Because precisely this factor, this Mujica Bachelet factor, this broad front was a legitimacy kind of factor for the entry point of the FTAs in countries that were part of Mercosur. Then by having Piñera in Chile, Macri in Argentina, and Temer in Brazil, now this became a lot easier, and Chile had successfully signed an FTA with Argentina, then an FTA with Brazil, and they became this sort of transmitter that started gathering all the countries of the Mercosur and the Pacific Alliance. So this was at the same time and in parallel with what Fernanda mentioned in her presentation, with the weakening or intentional weakening of cooperation and regional organisms that had introduced their link within or through many years until the point that we found ourselves in this current situation where we have organisms as CELAC, and we've tried to install in our country the idea, such as in the 90s, that every integration mechanism will go through only the financial side, only through the tariff regulation, leaving aside the analysis some core elements such as what are the sectors of each one of the countries that can be harmed with this type of policy. And in the case of Chile, this is about making the society believe that the macroeconomical figures and the benefit of the big corporations or the big companies or the big economical financial groups have to do with the national benefit. But what does the president of the Small and Mid-Sized Company Association of Chile think? And we, by the way, have an inflation phenomenon that we haven't had for many decades, but the true cancer of mid and small-sized companies in Chile is not inflation, but rather the financial concentration. And up next, he explains, we don't have an internal market, and the only ones that are entering it are the big companies that at the same time use us as suppliers in draconian conditions. So within the functioning of the businesses and between the big and small-sized companies or mid and small-sized companies in countries such as Chile, we have a big important difference. And we see these new alliance type of policies coming up. And we have a different scenario in the region, which is quite different. In the case of Chile, we have In the government, we have President Boric, and President Boric, when he was the deputy, he was an advisor of the fight against the FTA, and he was opposed to PTP in the Chamber of Deputies. But now we face ourselves in a situation where the same officials are in government receiving pressure with increasing levels of success to obtain a different outlook to these matters. TPP 11, it's blocked right now in Senate, and we need to say that the only country in the world where the TPP has not been approved due to the social mobilization is Chile. And back then it seemed like the treaty or the agreement didn't have any feasibility, but now that the people that were against this TPP in the government are faced with a situation where in the alleged name of progress and alleged name of relief of financial crisis, we ask government to move forward with the approval of a TPP 11 just as, because this is the only factor that we have at play at this point, which is a common factor for countries such as Chile and in different countries of Mercosur. The free trade agreement with the European Union, which is called cooperation agreement, and in our case the update, and in the case of Mercosur we have the signature. So facing that situation and that circumstance is that I think that we have to ask ourselves collectively certain of the gradients and differences that we can encounter here and in different spaces, and but in relation to what we had before with the same signs in Peru are differently in Colombia and with the different signs in Colombia. So you could probably understand that in the summit of the Pacific Alliance that we will have in a couple of months, we can probably attend to an intention of having a different policy regarding our region. But precisely there is where we have progressive governments that don't have enough margin to develop a financial policy that's really different from the last few years and what we've known in the last few years. We have the risk that through this leadership that have a higher level of prestige within the popular understanding, we can validate this document. So in a way it gets to be really important on one side to exchange experiences among social movement and organizations of the different countries, independently from what the level of development is that we've had. And it's really necessary, second of all, the exchange of information for those countries that there's less generation of reflection regarding free trade agreement, and it will allow them to open the discussion and to generate the complementarity to be able to coincide in the path that these governments will take in regards of these policies. We have really important legislation in regards of TPP 11 and in regards of commercial agreements with the European Union, so they can move forward towards that direction. The types of influences are quite a lot, and we have different ways of financing that are softer and harder, but we also have more direct and indirect influences, and everything ends up influencing the columns that authorities end up making decisions with. So the background is that we will end up recovering, just as Fernanda mentioned, an outlook of sovereignty and a politicized outlook of this type of topics that seem to be kind of slippery or hard type of topics, like Jorge said in one of the conversations that we had, and to understand what are these instruments where there's a lot of roof in the conversations of transformational policies. In our country, we need to make sure that we are favoring these systems for a fairer system, and we can seem affected in the signature of the TPP because the greatest amount of companies of revenue or income in Chile, rent in Chile are from U.S. ownership. So we are under the impression that we are not talking about international matters or technical issues or too far away from what we know, but actually topics that can have harsh consequences and persistent consequences throughout time in the life of people. And I wanted to share this experience that it's not just a part of what we had to live in Chile, but also what we had to live off of the different articulation and discussion and conversations that I had with some of the colleagues that are present here, and we hope that in different situations we can translate this into different types of work in Latin America and the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. Now we're going to listen to our colleague Aída García Naranjo. For Peruvians, there's not much of a presentation that needs to be done, but for all those who are not Peruvian citizens, it is important to say that Mocha is a master's in gender and equality policies from Mexico. So Flaxo, she has several diplomas in political science. She has been, and I will not go through the entire roster. She has been Peru's ambassador to Uruguay. He has been Peru's representative before ALA, DI, the Latin American Integration System, also Mercosur. She has a ministry of Peru's Ministry for Women and Social Development. Mocha, we would like to ask you to elaborate or talk in your presentation and your conference about the current condition, state of integration throughout the region. We understand there is multiple integration, separational integration, continental integration spaces and forums, and principally in this process to reinvigorate ECLEC after 4 years of almost total inactivity. What are we doing, and what is the meaning of social ECLEC's proposal that they and several other social organizations have been lobbying for in several ministries of foreign affairs? So over to you for the next 20 minutes for your comments on this topic.
Hermano americano, libera tu esperanza con un grito en la voz. En realidad,
Matter of fact, there is no better way to summarize regional integration than these lyrics of the Sing With Me and all the voices together. And I want to say that resisting is as important as pushing forth. So it is very important that you can all stay here in this multifaceted reflection that is certainly going to make us all richer to have a diverse and a complex view which is needed by the current state of affairs. Thanks you, Latin Dad and the Social Justice Network for inviting me to this great meeting of social political actors from integration networks that is so important at a conference that we have called After the Pandemic, the War. It is something like if we had been talked after getting beaten, we get stoned. However, I have dared to reflect, to think about why we have been invited here, because this is the COVID pandemic, but it's also the pandemic of weapons. This could be also the words used in naming this conference, because we're talking about the pandemic of COVID, we're talking about the pandemic of the industrial military complex, it is the pandemic of vaccination and the pharmaceuticals and the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
ideológica frente a
We're also immersed in an ideological dispute concerning vaccines. We're not here just talking about Latin America, Africa, and the world in a global scenario, transcending global scenario, and here we are immersed in a vaccines dispute. We are among the countries in the world with the largest percent rates of deaths. Last year, Peru had 250,000 deaths, even worse than the war that led to the death of 20,000 people from Chile, Bolivia, and Peru, and the internal conflict from the 80s to 2000 killed 87,000 people. And this is the vaccines war that compromised our own governments. And the kind of soldiers that we have had in this world, and where AstraZeneca, Seneca, and Pfizer competed against the Sputnik, Pfizer, and Soberanxs, the 5 Cuban vaccines. However, we were not able to buy the vaccines within our own region, despite the fact that we have a multilateral tools that could allow us to engage in a shared procurement. This the Hippolyto-Unanue agreement mandated us to share health policies to face an unacceptable rate of deaths. Well, thank you for the invitation, because this is not any any moment in time for reasons of time. Jorge has asked me to focus on CELAC's ECOLAC's pass for this year, and however, this has to be done against the backdrop and the second wave, as we call it in Latin America. So specifically, to abide by the time that I've been allocated, what we are living through is a structural crisis. We're living through a global transition, but this is a transition ruled by a disorderly world governance. This transition has not concluded, and the world is looking to get out of unipolar single power hegemony, and in that way we can see the decline of the U.S., the abatement of their world hegemony, and the eruption of China as a world power. And there are solid power poles that create difficulties to Washington. There's a hybrid war that has translated in the trade tariffs war recent year, because the 2008 economic crisis was never solved. Also, we have 54 countries in Africa that is larger than Latin America, so the European Union, and that creates a very important space and condition about which we have to reflect. In 2021, China signed an agreement with ECOLAC, and of course this transition is not exempt of resistances and a conflict. And what does this scenario create for us to move from a one power world, the United States, as has already been said, and we will be delving into this in a moment, realize that this world is in transit, and the transit is happening, and they are very creative in trying to structure a two-power world. They, the United States, the UK, the European Union, and the other pole. There are others that think in a two-pole based on China and the US. Others think in terms of China, Russia, and China, and others think about a multipolar world where we don't want any hegemony, but rather we have an important representative space that has been lost, that Latin America and the Caribbean have lost, and we are proposing to create a regional pole in a multi-power world that heralds the end of the one power world. Many writers have discussed this very important about this very important issue, because this is not minor transition, and it is, I think, correct to take this debate strictly out of the academic and civil society forums to make it a political debate. And this is what I salute in this very important initiative to bring us together under the Latin data aegis. What we hear is that we are moving from the west to the east, and they also talk about the failure of the globalization construct. Some authors are talking about 4 scenarios. One poses a consensus that the U.S. loses technological and business power, but they will not lose their military power because they have a huge expenditure on defense. And the second scenario in this transition poses whether the U.S. will allow the unipolar world so easily, or will they appeal to other mechanisms, including military options. So we have to get ready, because we in Latin America, we have heard the U.S. and Trump say that they did not discard the war option to intervene in Venezuela. We should not discard that the first military power would appeal to what Latin America does not want, because we want to continue being a territory of peace. In the second scenario that is designed, the threat is the escalation where a military conflict between Russia and NATO would take precedence, and also including in that conflict the South China Sea, and to set up a coalition led by the U.S. against China, and that would be its main objective. And the fourth scenario would be Pedro Sanchez's coalition in an alliance with Morocco that would eventually find a subsidiary state in the Maghreb, that's Morocco, to engage in a war against Algeria, and that implies that we need to protect the Sahrawi people, because that's part of the conflict. And I wanted to conclude this segment on the global scenarios by saying that just yesterday at Telebrana, that we so much respect, recognize, and value. I could have any more adjectives to praise him, that we should not have these left-leaning views about what's happening in the world. Even Carter is not certainly an ultra-leftist or a communist, and Tony Blair, who was not mentioned yesterday, poses a strategy. He has said that we are reaching the end of the political and economic dominion of the West, and the world is facing global geopolitical changes and the transition to multipolarity. This is not our definition. This is a definition that comes from Tony Blair, and he makes important recommendations in this respect. He says the world will be less bipolar and possibly multipolar. He appeals that in this century the main enemy will be China, not Russia, and he says so clearly, and perhaps on an equal footing of China with the West. So he says that we have to put our eyes on Africa and India, and indeed in among his concerns about China, he's saying that we cannot talk for certain that China would not invade Taiwan, and therefore we have to get ready from a military viewpoint. And that's what Tony Blair says, and that the Midwest, India, and Indonesia are critical. What should we conclude from these ideas in this world context? Because the idea is that we propose here a number of ideas for reflection so that we can act towards a transformation. We have to think of Latin America in a framework against the background of a multipolar world as an autonomous region in a new order, an order of peace. And that has been particularly successful, for instance, when we ran the No to Alca campaign. We have to think in terms of a core campaign for this period. And when moving back to land market, because we're talking here about the second pink wave, the progressive wave. And not just because ECLAC has been reactivated since last year, and we had the privilege of going to Mexico to share with other foreign ministers and presidents that fundamental historical moment. There were four important things. There was an initial offensive stage, conservative stage, a conservative restoration, including Macri, the coup against Dilma, Evo Morales, and the triumphs of Post Street or Temer and Bolsonaro. Undoubtedly, that's the scenario that we were living in, and that meant conservative restoration. Yes, indeed, but that influenced the weakening of a regional integration. We cannot uncouple those triumphs where the U.S. did not want any more political presidents. They wanted managers. That was Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, that was a Duque. They replaced the politicians for multinational corporation CEOs who were used to the revolving door policies. Secondly, that situation has been reverted, and that's important, and that's why it's important we were there to see Obrador's victory in Mexico, or Fernandez's in Argentina, or ours in Bolivia. It is important to remember Chile, because we must remember that it took Chile decades to get rid of Pinochet, but Bolivia managed to face the Ames coup to restore democracy in 12 months. This has no precedent. If Latin Americans have lived through and supported resistance and asylum support to Bolivia, to Argentina. We're not even talking about the AAA down the road, but it is important to realize the importance of the Bolivian situation. Of course, the victories that came afterwards and that were as important as Castillo's victory, Xiomara Castro's, and the Barrick's victory, and then Petro's victory. How not celebrate Pedro, who for 40 years he has been fighter. This is not an improvised politician. He has lived through a process that resulted in 800,000 words and that voted against peace in their referendum, where there were still 100,000 disappeared persons. The triumph to close the last 20 years of right-wing governments in Colombia is critical for Latin America. And of course, we are all talking about Lula's victory in the first elections round, but we must not forget September 4th. This is a victory in Chile that we have to support in electing the new constitution. There's been a turn to the left that will favor the integration of people, but there can be a reflux. We have not totally trust that the left should be the human face of capitalism, because there's a level of frustration under these circumstances. And also, the second wave is not like the first one for a number of reasons that have to do with the complex pandemic situation, the war, the low commodities quotation, slow changes, and a number of the skepticism among the people that politics and policies would eventually be successful. We feel that ECLAC is a fundamental forum. For the last 11 months, we have given birth to the social ECLAC. We do not think in integration only from from top to bottom. Mercosur made an attempt with the Solidary and the social Mercosur that's been mainstream despite its weaknesses. UNASUR also created the social participation forum. Now that we have our friend Fernanda Vallejos, with whom we have talked about social ECLAC, and we salute that Mexico has reactivated that, and that today's pro tempore chair is residing in Argentina, and the Troika will have to meet with a CARICOM country for a subsequent session, because if they meet again, out of these multidimensional thinking, we have to realize that the exit, the way out, is global, not an individual way out. And this has to be a multidimensional. In relation with one country, we can see the impact of human rights violations and labor rights violations and extractivism, the exaggerated natural resources depredation, and discrimination against women. So we have to salute that Latin that adopts this multinational view, because this is critical. We have traveled across all these countries, and we have talked about all these victories, and we have set up a ECLAC integration team to place this integration agenda, just like in Mercosur and UNASUR. Also in ECLAC, we have to take advantage and profit from past experiences of the Social World Forum, the Summit of the Americas, the migrations World Summit. We have talked about the world crisis, but we have omitted talking about the migration crisis. The Mediterranean Sea is the tomb of African migrants. This is a fundamental issue in this crisis. Now that we are celebrating 1 year, the birth certificate was assigned September 13th last year. Social ECLAC is 1 year old, and it has been joined by 67 organizations throughout Latin America. And we need a new manifest to ratify, confirm this political will, and that has been sent to the Argentinian pro tempore chair that will be meeting in Argentina again in November together with all the presidents. The foreign ministers meeting has already taken place, and then the pro tempore chair will be delivered to CARICOM, and the previously there was Mexico, presently it's Argentina, and then the next one will be the Caribbean. And we want to invite these reflections to be included in the new manifest that will be much richer, a lot more multi-dimensional. It will include shared visions, and we will be therefore moving towards a new stage. And we invite everybody that is here to make this manifest signed, and will result in a level of mobilization throughout our countries to articulate and finally say that these new integration policies require strengthening ECLAC. We have to adopt the new visions. Our UNASUR colleagues think that UNASUR also has to be reactivated, as has already been proposed by President Lula. And we have heard new options to recover UNASUR, to reactivate its various instances, and the technical secretariat. Guillermo Lan, the second foreign minister of the citizen revolution, has talked about practical ways of reactivating these organizations, not just because there are less countries. Nothing mandates that all countries should be included. I think that we have to reflect about his proposals and the articulation of Mercosur so that it should not be dissolved, nor should UNASUR be dissolved. I think that they have to be kept as integration forms. There have been other complementary and academic spaces and debates, and there are instances of reflection that should delve into these issues, dive deep into these issues, and we're certainly going to celebrate ECLAC's reinvigoration. It's a greater articulation, it's a participation in a multipolar world, and take a political view, an integrated political view that talks about multilateralism rather than a unipolar world. Thanks very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much. We have now online Mónica Valente and Ricardo Patiño. We'll ask you please to only use 10 minutes, and I'll let you know once we are approaching the 10 minutes. And what is the reflection that you have nowadays? Mónica in the Sao Paulo Forum. And what is the comment or reflection that the Sao Paulo Forum is doing about the new political moment that the region is living, about the integration topic for our region in the framework of these geopolitical changes? And the same thing for you, Ricardo, from the Puebla group, which is the other articulation of political forces of the sectors of progresses, left sectors that are looking at us right now. Now we'll open the mic for Mónica, which is connected from Brazil. It's kind of late for her, later than us. And please, Mónica, go ahead. Thank you very much, dear colleague Jorge Coronado. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Thank you very much, Jorge Coronado, and to our colleagues of Latindad, from Social Justice, for the invite. It's really interesting. It's a really interesting debate and reflection about if we are living these new times after the pandemic and after the war, while the war lasts at least. If we can put up to debate this topic that I believe is strategic for us in Latin America and people from the Caribbean, which is the regional integration subject. I want to salute our colleagues to Fernanda Vallejos, to Eduardo Patricio López, and Aída García Naranjo, and to my colleague Ricardo Patiño, for giving me the honor of being here sharing this topic with you. I believe that Fernanda Vallejos, Mocha, and Patricio López have outlined the context, at least the geopolitical side of it, where we live as a humanity, as countries. And we have proven that there's a need, that facing these deep geopolitical changes and financial changes and transitional changes from unipolar hegemony to the possibility of multipolarity, it's a possibility that we have to explore it, and we have to follow that trend so we can make it so. I believe that this is completely proven, the need for Latin America and Caribbean of having regional integration as a fundamental tool for our people and for our countries. In this new geopolitical context and geofinancial context that we live in humanity, if the regional integration was before an historical flagship of our people and of the Sao Paulo Forum, to face the neoliberal model and to the imperialism and to colonialism that we are still suffering from the empire of the US. Now more so in that scenario of transition, of unipolarity, for different possible scenarios, just as described by Mocha, the possibilities of scenarios that can come up of this transition of unipolarity towards a different type of model, and also facing the risks that the humanity suffers and that we do in Latin America as well. Environmental risks, sanitary risk, hunger, and of increase of poverty, taking into account that we live and we are still living under a financial crisis that's getting deeper and deeper lately. As the Sao Paulo Forum, we can say that the first progresses wave between quote signs that we had in our region was an important wave because it allowed us to build organisms, institutions, multilateral institutions that we didn't imagine we were going to achieve doing, like the strengthening of Mercosur, the entry of Venezuela to Mercosur, the creation of UNASUR in 2008, and the creation of CELAC in 2010. And there was a process of integration. There was a path that we needed to follow that still has many challenges. And now in this second wave, it's important to have you into account so we can move forward and for the regional integration to take place in Latin America and Caribbean, not for it just be a multilateral organism that can, and in case there's no strategy that's really strong, maybe we can have popular participation. The participation of people can, as we've seen with UNASUR, can from one moment to the other vanish. And I believe that for that, we need to think about this second wave that, as a matter of fact, we will have, or we already have a previous experience with, and we will have to learn with our improvements from the previous period and overcome the challenges that we weren't able to overcome in the previous time. But we need to define content from a priority and agenda, under my opinion, and besides strengthening of or strengthening this bilateral institutionality that we want to build. For example, in the case of UNASUR, which is something that's really important to deepen, like Mocha said. But the relaunch of CELAC and with the social CELAC, it's also necessary that we can put up content within the process, a strategic content in this integration processes that can respond to the needs of our people. So some of these contents, some of these agendas are really important to put the debate on the table. So this can generate the content for our agenda. So I will be leaning to put this reflection up the table. This the management that offers us all the possibilities of moving forward, of opening spaces for energetic communication, but in a new situation and in a new situation of that's changing or shifting, in a situation when there's a new model of development, with a different model that will preserve the environment, and thinking with new or true new technologies and thinking about the protection of Mother Earth. That is a gigantic challenge, but if we will think about, for example, President Petro in one of his first proposals for the Colombian people, Well, we had the zero petroleum subject. President Lula said that that's an important proposal, but for Brazil, we might not be able to implement it immediately. But this is something that affects the daily life of our people, energetic issues, and we can follow that path. We can say that one of the first general secretaries of UNASUR and the Venezuelan Ale Rodriguez, he wrote many articles about it. But this is also something related to sovereignty, and this is something that has to do with our suffering as people. But our region is a region that's really productive and really proactive in that sense, to think about integration or regional integration and taking into account the sovereignty or food sovereignty of our people, but also facing the world. The third and last, I believe, is the health subject. Mocha has given us a lot of examples about how we disadvantage the possibilities that we have related to vaccine, medication, and many different things in the health field, where we could have, for example, one of the first things or one of the main advices that UNESCO has created as the Council of the Ministers of Health status. I would like, and we would like to have that so we can face the pandemic of COVID-19. We would have a different scenario. And finally, to close it off, beyond all this content and this agenda, we would like to give background to the regional integration agenda, not just for our people, but also to provide, and we can say, steps moving forward, to move forward. And so I would say that the huge challenge, again, for the second wave is to deepen into the participation and the protagonism of people and of the population in this new institutionality, this multilateral institutionality. CELAC, as Mocha mentioned, but we also have the UNASUR, or under UNASUR, the proposal that President Evo Morales is leading to provide and give a voice to a plurinational America, which is more important. But it's not only precise to create institutionality within CELAC or within UNASUR, or to deepen into what we have in Mercosur, but rather it's also necessary to do what we really think social movements and popular movements and our autonomous organizations, our people can insist and do effectively in the path of integration, of regional integration in Latin America. So I think that's fundamental, because if we are able to do that in the regional framework, just as in the national plans, for our progressive governments that are facing all types of difficulties, we won't be able to make Latin America and Caribbean to be placed or seen as a sovereign or in a sovereign position, given the global painting that's drawn, especially for Latin America and Caribbean, and the people as protagonists of this scenario. Certainly, once again, will have to pay a high price of hunger, unemployment, migration, people suffering, and under all this conflict that we don't want as Latin America and Caribbean. I would say, and I will just give you these two reflections and put it up in the table so we can move forward in the making of new changes and facing these challenges. I come from Colombia, right now in Brazil, but I had a nice time in Colombia. And the so in this election, this Colombian president's election, it warms our heart. And from Brazil, we can say that in Latin America, we would like to give you a sample of citizenship. I would like to give you a sample of victory through Lula's victory in October. We hope to do that. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Monica. And we'd like to thank you for your availability to join us and to accept this invite to this conference. And up next, we will open the mic to our colleague, Ricardo Patiño, that has been Chancellor, as I said at the beginning, of Ecuador, is a dear friend, really close to Latindad. He's been with us in the People's Summit. So he's a friend of the house. So Ricardo, just as Monica, what's your feedback? How you value this from the Puebla group? What are you doing with the region, current context, the political context of the region, and in this political context regarding regional integration? You have 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Latindad and to all the participants in the room and online. Thanks for the invitation. I would just like to clarify that I'm a member of the Puebla group. However, formally, I do not represent this group formally because we haven't had the opportunity to organize it this way. I will share with you my opinions that will certainly reflect also the opinions of several members of the Puebla group. I wanted to share with you my ideas in two sections. In the first place, the understanding and that there is an emerging new world panorama. This is critical for integration because it's one thing to go through integration in 1980 to go through an integration process in 1980, and a totally different thing is to do it in the second decade of the 21st century because the world's economy and the world's power has shifted significantly. It is not totally different, but it has shifted significantly. The continental plates have moved. I'm talking here about the U.S., Asia, Russia, Africa, Latin America, the European Union, in particular the first one. The large powers are totally different than what they used to be. The U.S. is no longer the country that had only almost that wielded almost exclusive power in military, communications, technological and defense issues, and imposed upon the entire world after the fall of the Wall of Berlin and the subsequent changes in world policy in the first and second decades of the 20th century. The last decades of the 20th century, they imposed their neoliberal policies. The change in the route of world geopolitics is provoked by the vertiginous ascent of the People's Republic of China's economy that since 2016-2017 has overtaken the U.S. economy. It is worthwhile mentioning some pieces of data when the first cycle started. I don't want to talk about waves and waves may die back. Cycles are a little bit more permanent. There may be a movement backwards, but I like the cycle concept better than the idea of a wave. When the first progressive government cycle throughout our region started at the beginning of the 21st century, the U.S. had an economy that was equivalent to 20% of the world's economy, while the Chinese economy reached about 80% of the world's economy in the first years of the 21st century. That was the situation. But then the U.S. economy dropped from 20 to 16% of world's GDP, while the Chinese economy rose from 8 to 19% of the world's GDP. In the recent years, in the last 30 years, the U.S. has been growing at a rate of 9%, while the U.S. has been growing at 4%. So the Chinese economy doubles every 5 years, while the U.S. economy doubles every 25 years, quarter century. So levels of international and domestic investment and local savings and technological breakthroughs and domain over world trade also show a clear advantage of China and Asian countries, and there is emerging evidence that there is a new international division of work, and this is very important for Latin American and Caribbean countries to understand this, because there is a new international division of labor, and where we have to decide what should be our share. I don't want to get into the other topics that also have to do with the world's hegemony, the military, defense, communications, the technological facets, but what seems clear is that the changes that have been discussed here right now and in prior presentations will bring about new world institutions, both in the political and the trade and financial and environmental realms. The world, by the way, in regards of the environment, cannot close its eyes to the destruction of the world's environment. Miguel Descato, our dear Nicaraguan foreign minister, put forth at the United Nations Assembly the possibility of setting up the International Climate Justice. This was a proposal that was made almost 50 years ago by the Father Manuel Descato. He proposed to set up a Climate Justice International Court that should be even more important than the IMF. And that has imposed U.S. and EU recipes. This new instance should be charged with preserving life on the planet. In coming decades, we will see a change in the power relations within the United Nations. It is not likely that the international financial system will remain as is at present under the aegis of the U.S. dollar as a principal reserve currency. The BRICS bank could eventually exceed the World Bank's and the IMF's funding capacities together, but it's only taken its baby steps. It is very important for Latin America to understand that there is a new panorama that is emerging, a new panorama with new institutions that will be created, but rather that must be created with our participation. And in regards to the comments by prior speakers, we all agree in setting and creating a multipolar world. A multipolar world, however, cannot be created with separate countries. We have to act as a bloc. We have to go through a valid and robust integration process if we want to participate in a multipolar world vis-a-vis the US, EU, Russia, China, and the African Union, while each of our Latin American and Caribbean countries would be recognized individually unless we have the force of a union binding us together. And the second thing that I wanted to talk about in this intervention has to do with the prospects of Latin American integration, that what should we do in this new period that we are going through, what should we build? We have to relaunch the will to integrate. Fortunately, many countries already have left-leaning and progressive countries, and we can reconfigure integration. I don't want to get into the details of CELAC or ECLAC or UNICEF, but basically I would like to mention what should be some of the contents of that integration so that we bear that in mind, that we fall in love with that. We have to be the promoters, ambassadors, sponsors. We have to sell the idea, and we have to be in love with the idea. We have to be persuaded by the idea, together build with civil society from Latin American and the Caribbean that construct. I'm going to say it very briefly so that we will just not forget these takeaways. In the first place, we have to build a vision of regional integration. It should not be a fragmented vision. We should have a view of which way Latin America and the Caribbean should be moving towards as a society. What kind of society? A solidarity society, a good living society. There are many words like 21st century socialism, but this is a vision that our society should aim at, and how we should participate in that new international division of labor. On the other hand, what should be the components of that integration? And I'm going to say it as briefly was very briefly, to consolidate as a peace territory. This is a superior good that we cannot abhor and that we have to cling to with all our strengths. And secondly, the protection of our democracies and a sound determination. We have to protect our democracy in our countries. And I would like that we someday we should not have a European elections observation mission. The missions should be our own. It be organized by ECLAC, by our own democracies, a true Latin American and Caribbean human rights system, not the OAS, by a system that is guided and directed by the United States and that partly finances it. And fourthly, to reject actively the embargo of the United States for our country. We cannot allow these offenses to international law and the independence of our country by imposing sanctions that result in the hunger of our peoples. But we have to react actively as a country in view of the aggression of these countries that impose these kinds of sanctions. We have to build Latin American citizenship. We have to have a Latin American and Caribbean passport like they have in the United States and the United States, because they're United States. We should have the Latin American passport. We have to address the drugs issue. Unfortunately, Latin America follows the U.S. failed strategy. Everybody has recognized. I have not seen one single person that has a minimum of common sense that will uphold the strategy that the U.S. has imposed on Latin America in regards to drug trafficking that's so costly in terms of financing and lives. We have to have our own collective response to the drug issues. We have to also have a response, an integrated regional response to natural disasters and on health issues. We have already gone through the horrible COVID experience, and we have to have a response to climate change and have a region-wide social protection network, so that if an Ecuadorian moves to Argentina or to Peru or Nicaragua, we would have a regional safety net that will be understood as a right of the people that live in this region, and set up a controversy, a conflict solution center, and not have to go to ICSID or the European Union to solve these issues with investors that oftentimes hurt our economies. We have to think in terms of a complementary economic structure and not a competitive structure. We have to think in terms of complementary production. Yes, Ricardo, will you please? And also to have a sovereign policy and a self-sufficiency energy resources policies and food sovereignty as well. To wrap it up, just give me a couple more seconds. Financial integration. The South Bank, the Banco del Sur, was about to open its doors. So we have to do that right now rather than have a World Bank that not renders the same kind of benefits that we could obtain from the Banco del Sur. And to have our own monetary fund instead of the International Monetary Fund, and have our own currency and stop depending on a U.S. dollar. We have to re-establish the Latin American and Caribbean Defense Council, because unfortunately many of our armed forces have as a guide the U.S. security strategy rather than our own. And finally, a regional science and technology and innovation system, because the only through developing science, technology, and innovation, which are very difficult to tackle separately, we have to do this together. We can look at the future of the region as being capable to rise to the challenges of a globalized world competitive economy, because that's the only way that we will be able to support strongly our project to build a Latin American and a Caribbean region. And I want to congratulate Latin and our colleagues for this outstanding initiative that we should continue to pursue, so that Bolivar's and San Martin's dream to build a great country will be rebuilt and be strengthened.
Gracias, Ricardo.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, and thank you very much for making time and accepting your invite in such a not normal time frame for this type of activities. So we'll modify what we have to do because time is slipped away from our fingers excessively. I'm really sorry. A lot of comprehension because we're really late. I'm just going to say 5 things that I had, and I've taken the attribute of taking as a strength of each one of you, of what you mentioned. Fernanda talked to us about the huge challenge that Latin America has facing this process of this reconfiguration of the global hegemony going to China, and how we position ourselves in that scenario. Patricio talked to us about economic integration based in free trade, sustained mainly in the secretism opacity as integrational axis. Mocha invites us to create a regional front in a multipolar, multi-front world as a strategical development. Mónica mentioned how to correct errors from our first progressive wave and deepen into agenda of true changes as challenges for this second wave. And Ricardo talked to us about the second progressive circle that's developed in a scenario that is absolutely new of financial economic reconfiguration that will determine importantly where are we heading, what are the limitations of the second progressive cycle. I want to, in behalf of Latinidad, thank Mocha, Patricio, Fernanda, ask you for apologies for the time, because we now have to read the final declaration and we can't do what we've been setting up in the panel. But I think that you put up in the table a diversity of arguments that will invite us, and it invites Latinidad to continue deepening into this debate about integration, political challenges that we have as people and as a state. So again, Fernanda and Patricio, Mocha, thank you very much. Mónica and Ricardo also. And I'll open the mic for Carlos, who's going to do a closing of this marathonic conference of Latindad. Thank you. While I'm closing this out, we take a picture of the panel. Just really quick. Okay, colleagues, thank you very much. I think it's been a couple of enriching journeys with a lot of content. Each topic that we've established here serves as to make one whole journey. This should have lasted at least 3 days, but we're satisfied with it. We'll go now to our final part, and I'll invite Adrian Falco, coordinator or executive secretary of the Network of Fiscal Justice, and Patricia Miranda, coordinator of New Architecture of Cabildeo Global of Latindad, so they can close the event. And after the final declaration, if you want to pick up some comments, you can write them down and we'll tag you all in the final picture.
Compañeras, unos minutos más, vamos con el siguiente panel. No, mentira, vamos con ningún siguiente.
All right, thank you very much. Panel, I swear to God, there's no other panel. We have a closing panel for this conference. In behalf of the Fiscal Conference of Latin America and Caribbean, we would like to thank you deeply that you've participated, that you've given us, that you've debated, because it's really important for us, all of this, because after 2 years, when we've seen each other only through little screens, we can hug each other, hold our hands, touch each other, and that, without a doubt, is the best thing that can happen. And we didn't know until the pandemic happened, so now we know it, and that's why we're really happy. Let me open the mic to Patricia Miranda from Latindad, so she can continue with our closing. Well, we made it, and in behalf of Latindad, I would like to tell you that we're really happy for organizing this conference after 3 years of our previous conference. And we're really happy as well because it's been a huge challenge to making a hybrid conference, hybrid with interpretation. I would like to thank the whole financial management network of both networks. I would like to thank the redactors team, our communications team, and all the team that's allowed us to have this type of conference of this level. And we're really satisfied. Also, we're really happy because and thankful for having all of you here. Also, with everyone that's connected through the different platforms, we've had a really enriching exchange. We've updated off of a lot of topics, and we've had challenges. We've heard about really urgent and strong proposals, and I'm leaving hopeful. I'm leaving hopeful, and with the energy of having shared with all of you and with people that are working and have such a valuable work towards financial, climate, and social justice. And with this hope, let me invite two of our youngest members from both networks so they can read the declaration. Let me invite Daniela Verdeja from Latindad and Lionel Stigler from the Fiscal Justice Network. Thank you, Patricia and Adrian. Final declaration of the regional conference. Is it on? Thank you. Okay, better. Okay, final declaration for the regional conference after the pandemic, the war. Latin America and Caribbean facing the challenges of the crisis. Lima in 8 and 9 of August 2022. Lima Declaration. The social organizations of civil society, guilds, authorities, activists, members of the academic world, the region, and the world that are present in this conference after pandemic, the war, subscribe and declare. Considering that one, the mean of these adjustments and imbalance created by the COVID pandemic, the world is living a grave moment that is expressing the huge increase of inflation, the raise of prices of energy, and the lack of food that risks many people. In Latin America, the situation takes us to a greater cycle of poverty and social exclusion, accentuating the differences in the continent. The inequalities against women have deepened due to the crisis and the recovery policies. Fourth, in the middle of this volatile financial, regional, and global situation, Latin America leaves a whole changing moment that can represent advances in the political scope. And fifth, the main challenge for the region is to establish a way through which we will face the different current crises. On the favoring path of favoring corporate elites and international and national elites, or an outing that allows and benefits the majority, the way that is chosen will mean the change of the current policy and goes after a positive change, or it might mean that it will be the same of the thing. 6. We start with a declaration to change the rules to preserve life, to bet on, that's the bet of NATO facing COVID-19 in May 2019, where we expressed the need of taking important measures to step out of the crisis. In the long midterm, where we had proposals as a new social agenda called the new financial economic rules, social sciences, and democratization, with an open elite of powerful financial power. The citizenship is organized to face the pandemic. That requires the greatest articulation possible from social organization and civil society of the region. 7. Latin America faces huge challenges due to multiple crises that is grave in terms of food, energy, taxes, and in many parts of the region a debt crisis. The income of mid-range countries in the region doesn't represent its reality, and they consider a future of social, financial, and climate vulnerabilities. 9. We have resources to finance the Agenda 2030 and the climate agenda, but we don't have a political will from the financial community for or towards social and financial justice. The world is going through a geopolitical shift, and this is a part of the social context. And 11, the planetary limits are being surpassed, putting on the line the life of people and the situation of the planet. 12, the recent elections of Gustavo Petro and the historical pact in Colombia of Gabriel Boric and Xiomara Castro and the Free Party in Honduras bring hope and challenges to our people by having transformational purposes of political inclusion, social justice, and financial climatic. We summon the social organizations too, in social or in fiscal justice, to fight for progressive measures that will provide us with the resources that are enough to finish with inequities, ensuring the rights of people and the access to basic needs, universal rights, and of quality, especially social protection and the spreading out of a productive methodology of the internal market. These reforms need to provide effectively taxes to generate a greater distribution that has a privilege system and advance on the matrix of productive system and underproductive models and ensures rights. To adding up efforts to the regional efforts of work to obtaining an international fiscal system of inequality of conditions that will end up in international fiscal fraud. To promote and encourage mechanisms of transparency that will face fiscal landscapes to stop illicit or illegal funds, and as an alternative means that will block the financing for a better of the social structure of our countries. To establish pressure on governments and to promote demands based on our agendas, looking after being recognized as a key actor in the fight for fiscal justice, to strengthen networks and promote strategic alliances among organizations, nationally, regionally, and globally, with the means of multiplying the voices that command action for a fiscal system that's fair, transparent, and equitable to the service of people. In injustice of the debt and financing, to fight for the cancellation of the debt in countries where the exposure has financial vulnerabilities, social, climatic, and the privatization of the debt is putting at risk social protection and life. To fight and opposing to austerity policies from the National International Fund and international community, to encourage the perspective of gender in economy, integrating feminist economy debates at all levels as an alternative to capitalism and patriarchy. To continue claiming the climate responsibility of the countries of the global north, alerting in the short time that humanity has to respond to this climatic crisis, to respond to climatic crisis just as for the markets of carbon that are being proposed in the framework of international negotiations on climate change, and that on top of it all, despite not solving the problem, will increase inequality in the world. To promote an international encounter in Colombia that will gather congressmen from the region with the means of making an exchange of proposals to obtain resources that will allow us to develop the promised social reforms. In transformational economy, we bet on the deep transformation in economy from the feminist perspective, the rights of nature, and climatic justice for a future that's sustainable and full sovereignty as collective rights, and the encouragement of basic universal rent, and the progressive effort as a part of the restructuration of the public debt to replenish the reparations and provide social justice. We invest in the construction of the democracy that we want, including in your agendas actions that can correct inequalities and relations of power that persist and affect our lives, minds, and territories. To articulate and influence international spaces that can make recommendations for governments facing inclusion and concrete actions that can respond to transformation of violence and the overcoming of affectations that affect Amazonic and Indian women. To back up the verdict of the Third Ethic Tribunal of the Bodies and Tribunal for Indian and Amazonic women that will continue its sessions and will continue figuring out and investigating about the cases that have been presented, to back out to the Tribunal of the Rights of Nature, and we do or set up such as this for the Amazon to be a threatened entity is subject to the rights that companies in complicity with governments have declared a war to, and the indigenous communities and settlements and campsites and traditional population, farmers, riverlands, and indigenous population, rural or urban, are those that are in the first line of this confrontation, and their rights need to be ensured. To declare an emergency or climate emergency status in the Panama Zone in this component to allow its active restoration and the biodiversity in coordination with Amazonian people, and advance to new paradigms of a relationship with nature. To reject public policies and extractivism of governments that will go against life and nature, moving forward to proposals such as living eyes and seen as more model of organization around life in new financial models and new financial subjects. In regional integration, that the international integration can be put up to the agenda of the organization and social movement from the focus of integration of people. Encouraging that the variable of regional integration can be a priority in the political agenda of Latin America and Caribbean. To encourage the participation process of civil society and the social movements and the mechanisms and organisms of participation that exist at CELAC, USUR, and we demand to public authorities and national authorities, regional authorities, and global multilateral authorities and of integration. First, to all of the governments of the region, especially to those of Chile and Colombia that just recently opened changes process to lead the organization of a regional summit against tax paradise, and to generate a space of constant coordination and fiscal policy that will go after CELACs. and go to make progressive tribute or tax reforms directed to huge fortunes, inheritance, and assets just for the extraordinary earnings of multinational societies. The elimination of fiscal exoneration of sectors that don't need it. The generation of a minimum global effort for our countries. Environmental and carbon rights for essential service and public policies, inclusive and of quality, to promote at the same time the decrease and elimination of taxes to the massive consumption of food. 3. To fight coordinatedly the global capacity of fiscal paradise, establishing mechanisms of control and transparency in operations, commercially speaking, and on multinational operations, automatic exchange of multilateral information, public reports of operation country per country, the final report and the final beneficiary report of companies, global registry of public access. As for the elimination of the fiscal secrecy and banking secrecy and the offshore societies. 4. To prevent the minimum of OECD and the global dominance, and creating an intergovernmental organism in the United Nations that will establish the binding character in a framework of full participation and democratic participation of all the countries, with a special emphasis of the countries of the southern global south, especially taking a special focus on Latin America and Caribbean to make a restructuring of the debt through a binding, transparent process with the headquarters in United Nations, and leave countries with mid-range income to apply an holistic view for financing policies and renegotiation of the debt instead of indicators that will hide realities such as the per capita GDP. 7. To eliminate imposing of conditionalities in the loans to the countries of the region that accelerate and improve negative impacts of the most impacted populations.
To approve a new issuance of a special drawing rights and a fair redistribution for South countries outside of IMF channels, given that the situation is currently even more dire than at the beginning of the epidemic, to stop private investment in the public services, particularly health and education, and to stop infrastructure projects for sustainable development objectives that have a negative social and economic impacts, to place the reduction of gender inequalities at the center stage of the economic and development recovery. The feminist transformation should be transformative, meet the commitments to reduce our debt, to adapt to climate change, to continue developing our natural resources without deepening extractivism in South Country, to organize a development conference to adopt democratic decisions for international economy recovery, for the Pan-Amazon countries to actually enforce the rights of the Mother Earth through true reforms and strengthened and compliance with their international commitments, rather than the so-called green economy measures, and to protect activists, protecting environmental activists, and prevent their harassment and menaces from drug offenders, and the compliance with the Escazú Agreement, to ratify and implement the right to a free, informed consent, including conscientious objection for cultural reasons, and to keep hydrocarbon resources underground, to turn ECLAC in the main regional integration tool, to so it will not be just a forum of heads of state, by encouraging the social eclogue that will include as agenda priorities the independence of the region in the present geopolitical structure. In Lima on August 9th, 2022, International Day of Indigenous Peoples.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Daniela and Lionel. If somebody wants to add something to the final declaration, you can do that through Carlos Bedoya, our Latin Dad organizer, and we will adapt those recommendations. And without further ado, please be invited to take a family photo. And now I declare the Latin Dad conference entitled After the Pandemic, the War.
Un, dos, tres, cuatro. ¿Me logras escuchar? ¿Me logras escuchar? Hablan. ¿Cómo? Tiene que llegar hasta el fondo, por si acaso. No sé. Sí, ya hasta el fondo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Manuel, levanta una mano si me estás escuchando. Levanta la otra si me estás escuchando. Levanta un pie si me estás escuchando. 1, 2, 3, 4. Un pie, por favor. Un pie. Salte, un pie. No te veo. Solamente veo tus pies. 1, 2, 3, ¿me estás escuchando o no me estás escuchando? 1, 2, 3, no te veo hasta el fondo. Di algo si me escuchas. ¿Me logras